I refer to myself as a liberator, while the West calls me a dictator. They have stolen our uranium, our gold, and the futures of our children for 7 decades. All the while, from ivory towers erected on African blood, they preach democracy. I don't bow, thus they want me gone. Refuse to sell my people for their comfort. Allow them to bring their assassins, sanctions, and playbooks for regime change. Independence was not inherited by my generation. We're going to accept it, and I proudly wear that badge if it makes me their adversary. What I'm about to show you will make you doubt everything you thought you knew about who truly rules Africa. One of the strongest men in the planet just received a message from a 35-year-old soldier, and that message is poised to upend the world's power structure in ways that will surprise you. What's really scary about this narrative, though, is this. There are more than 2 leaders involved. It's about a covert operation that has been going on under your nose for decades. The individual who just revealed it is either on the verge of becoming our generation's most powerful leader, or he is signing his own death sentence. You'll see why intelligence services on 3 continents are currently in full panic mode if you stick with me through this entire movie. The timing was 6:47 in the morning, Jerusalem time, when the encrypted mail reached the Prime Minister's secure server. Benjamin Netanyahu's security detail was most likely still making their morning coffee. Just 274 words that would send shockwaves across intelligence networks from Washington to Brussels to Tel Aviv. No pomp and circumstance, no diplomatic courtesy calls. 6 months ago, Ibrahim Traoré, the sender, was a man that most Western politicians couldn't even pronounce. They are closely observing his every action today, as if he were Nelson Mandela's successor. This is when things start to become really fascinating, though, and you should be watching what occurs next. Israeli media outlets were given clear instructions to completely shut down their operations within 3 hours of receiving that communication. Nothing, no analysis, no coverage. When was the last time a significant global story caused the Israeli media to be totally silent? I'll hold off. Meanwhile, newsrooms were blowing up all throughout Africa. Journalists were rushing to confirm what appeared to be impossible in Lagos, Accra, and Addis Ababa. Had Netanyahu just received an ultimatum from a young African leader? More significantly, did he have the authority to support it? But before we get into the real content of that ultimatum, believe me, it's explosive. You must comprehend the chess game that has been going on behind the scenes. Let's go back to 4 days ago, Kenya's Nairobi. Imagine this, a meeting room in a 5-star hotel. Crystal glasses, mahogany tables, and guys dressed in expensive suits debating West Africa's future as if they were dealing baseball cards. However, these weren't aid workers or diplomats. The goal of these economic advisors, private contractors, and intelligence officers was to change the political landscape in West Africa. The operation was called New Frontier, which sounds like it belongs in an espionage movie. However, the truth was far more sinister than fiction. I obtained audio that was released from that summit, and what I heard will make you furious. These weren't humanitarian debates about helping Africa develop. The purpose of these strategic planning sessions was to guarantee Western access to vital resources, control African leaders, and restrain burgeoning nationalist movements. This is the bit that will truly hit home for you, though. Buried in one of those audio files was a chat that named Traoré directly. Traoré's rise must be neutralized before Q4, said a voice in English with what intelligence analysts assumed to be an Israeli accent. We cannot overlook the economic consequences. For our partners neutralized, give that word some time to sink in. Foreign operators are considering the neutralization of a democratically supported leader of a sovereign nation as if he were a terrorist threat. This is something these geniuses didn't anticipate, though. A generation of young Africans who were fed up with having their decisions dictated to them by individuals who had never visited their continent is something Traoré had that most previous African presidents did not. Furthermore, the reaction to the released tapes on African social media was unheard of in contemporary African politics. This sounds like every previous narrative about foreign meddling in Africa. You may be thinking, why is this different? Here's what makes this unique and why it's making intelligence services anxious. Traoré's complaints about the intervention weren't the only ones. He didn't merely discuss African sovereignty in another address. He took a daring and unusual step that sent shockwaves across diplomatic channels across 3 continents, something no African leader has done in decades. He gave Israel what can only be called an ultimatum, not a plea, not a diplomatic complaint, an ultimatum. October 15, 2024, television of Burkina Faso state Traoré stood in military fatigues, staring straight into the camera with an intensity that made you sag forward in your chair. There was no press secretary, no prepared statements. Africa is not a chessboard, and we are not your pawns, he said in a measured, straightforward, and utterly devastating manner. However, that was only the first sentence. Masterful display of political bravery ensued, leaving international observers stunned. He presented evidence of clandestine activities aimed at influencing African nations. Point by point, he gave names. He made reference to particular operations. He produced documents that other governments believed were hidden so deep they would never be seen. Then he did something that shocked intelligence services around the world. To those who think they can continue to operate in the shadows while our people suffer, your shadows are now illuminated, he stated, staring straight into the camera. And we want to target every single endeavor, asset, and effort to deprive Africa of its future. This is where the tale really picks up steam, and you should know what transpired 48 hours after that broadcast. In a matter of hours, an unprecedented phenomenon started to occur on African social media sites. Young people were organizing, not just sharing the video, in languages that most Western social media analysts don't even keep an eye on. Began to gain popularity. However, this was not your average social media campaign. This was strategic, well-coordinated, and occurring more quickly than other countries could monitor or stop. Ghanaian students began disseminating in-depth analyses of mining enterprises under foreign management. In Nigeria, young activists started recording dubious diplomatic operations. Senegalese tech-savvy youth exposed foreign-affiliated shell corporations through viral threads. What began as a single man's broadcast declaration quickly expanded into a continent-wide probe of foreign meddling in less than 72 hours. Exactly 96 hours after that broadcast, the ultimatum was delivered. You'll see why diplomatic sources characterized it as the greatest direct challenge to Israeli foreign policy in decades when I tell you what it included. Though it was written like a legal document, his letter to Netanyahu read more like a declaration of war, not a military conflict, but one that would be more harmful to Israel's long-term interests, an economic and diplomatic conflict. The ultimatum contained a 30-day deadline and 3 demands that could not be changed. The first demand is that all clandestine activities in West Africa, not only in Burkina Faso, should end right away. And by covert operations, I mean anything from economic manipulation to political meddling to intelligence collection. The second demand is the withdrawal of all Israeli intelligence and military advisors who are presently working under diplomatic cover. There was more to this than official diplomats. This concerned employees of quasi-governmental entities, shell, corporations, and private contractors. The third demand, however, was the nuclear option. All businesses with ties to Israel that operate in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Guinea must disclose all of their assets and activities within 15 days or risk being seized right away. We are discussing assets that might be worth billions of dollars, including contracts for infrastructure, mining rights, and strategic investments. The truly startling thing is that Traoré did more than merely make these demands. He gave Netanyahu a comprehensive appendix that demonstrated the extent to which his administration was already aware of Israeli activities in the area. It is a masterwork of counterintelligence documentation. According to intelligence sources I have interviewed, diplomatic observers describe Tel Aviv's quick and frightened response. The highest echelons of the Israeli government called emergency meetings within hours. We're talking about foreign policy advisors, intelligence chiefs, and economic ministers, not just defense personnel. Here's what makes their response so intriguing though, and why it shows how seriously they take this threat. Israeli officials started what diplomatic sources refer to as rigorous damage assessment procedures after Traoré's ultimatum, rather than instantly dismissing it as the tirade of an inconsequential African leader. They were attempting to determine 3 things. To what extent is Traoré truly knowledgeable? How did he find out about this? And above all, who else could be able to obtain the same intelligence? Here's the horrifying truth for Israel. What does Traoré's level of knowledge about Israeli activities in West Africa mean for Israeli operational security globally? However, the hysteria in European capitals was far worse than the panic in Tel Aviv. The ramifications were instantly apparent to France, which has a vast network of influence in West Africa of its own. What will happen when Traoré focuses on French influence networks once he is successful in revealing and disrupting Israeli operations? This is what transpired in Washington behind closed doors, which shows how bad the issue has gotten. Senior State Department officials devoted an entire weekend to examining what they are referring to as the Traoré precedent. According to people familiar with high-level briefings, they are worried about more than just Israeli activities in Africa. They are also worried about what would happen if other African presidents began adopting Traoré's strategy. Consider it. What would happen if DRC politicians were to insist on openness regarding mining activities? What happens if Nigerian officials start disclosing agreements made by oil companies? What happens if politicians in South Africa begin looking into foreign intelligence operations? Relationships between the West and Africa may undergo a radical reorganization. This is where the narrative becomes even more dramatic though, because Netanyahu was not the only recipient of Traoré's ultimatum. Other foreign countries active in West Africa received similar communications, according to intelligence sources. We're talking about France, the United States, China, and several European powers. This wasn't just about Israel. This concerned a basic threat to the entire framework of foreign influence in Africa. This is when things start to become really fascinating, and you should be aware of what comes next. Days after the ultimatum was given, Africa saw the start of an extraordinary event. After decades of silence, leaders began to speak up. The ruling party in South Africa released a statement defending President Traoré's right to defend national sovereignty. A resolution calling for comparable openness on foreign activities in Nigeria was approved by the country's young parliament. Investigations of mining contracts with foreign businesses were demanded by Ghana's opposition parties. This went beyond merely endorsing Traoré diplomatically. This was the start of what foreign policy analysts refer to as an African sovereignty cascade. Anyone who stands to gain from the current global power structure should be terrified by this part of the story. In addition to giving Netanyahu an ultimatum, Traoré offered a fresh example of how smaller countries might take on superpowers in the digital era. Consider the classic playbook. When a smaller country faced problems with a superpower, its only choices were to protest to international organizations, which could take years to resolve, or hope for lenient media coverage in nations where the media is frequently swayed by the same forces they are opposing. All of that was avoided by Traoré. He spoke directly to young people throughout Africa who are aware, connected, and fed up with having adults who have never lived there tell them what's best for their continent. Young Africans were conducting in-depth investigations into foreign operations in more than 20 nations within 2 weeks of his ultimatum. It was not possible to influence or stop these official inquiries. These investigations, which were driven by social media and crowdsourcing, were yielding results more quickly than conventional intelligence organizations. But something important about how seriously Israel is taking this threat is revealed by Netanyahu's response to all of this. Israeli officials started what intelligence sources refer to as intense engagement practices in place of the conventional approach, which would have been to reject Traoré as an inconsequential African leader. Increased diplomatic outreach to African capitals, high-level contacts with African Union members, and what insiders characterize as substantial financial commitments to development projects throughout West Africa are all on the agenda. Put another way, Israel is radically changing their strategy for dealing with Africa because they are taking Traoré's demands seriously enough. Here's what's truly intriguing though, and what makes the underlying stakes of this conflict clear. Netanyahu's response goes beyond preserving Israeli activities in Africa. The goal is to preserve Israel's standing as a major world power. What does it say about Israel's place in the world power system? If a 35-year-old African leader can successfully oppose Israeli foreign policy and compel major behavioral adjustments from Israel, these are the events that are taking place as the ultimatum deadline draws near. According to intelligence sources, Israeli operations in West Africa are undergoing various phases of reorganization or closure. A few operations have been shut down entirely. Some are being kept under more secrecy, while others have been moved to other organizational structures. However, what Israel is doing in reaction to the ultimatum is not the actual question. Whether Traoré's model is scalable and sustainable is the true question. The harsh truth is that opposing superpowers is a risky endeavor. From Patrice Lumumba to Thomas Sankara, history is replete with instances of leaders who refused to bow to outside pressure and suffered the consequences. African presidents who oppose foreign rule have frequently been eliminated through coups, unexplained deaths, or other means. Traoré is aware of this past. His security detail has grown considerably. His travels have been limited. Additionally, according to intelligence sources, he is acting as though he is a target. The difference between this scenario and previous ones, however, is that Traoré is not acting alone or covertly. His every action is captured on camera and shared on social media. Every meeting he attends is either filmed or streamed live. Millions of young Africans are watching this confrontation as if it were the most significant political drama of their generation, and they are aware of every decision he takes. Traditional tactics of elimination are made considerably more difficult and risky for foreign powers by this degree of transparency. Here's where this story is going and why it's important that you know what's involved. We are not merely observing a diplomatic conflict between Burkina Faso and Israel. We are keeping an eye on a new international relations model's beta test. Traoré will have proven that smaller countries can effectively oppose superpowers by utilizing digital age techniques and tactics. If he is successful in getting Israel to abide by his demand without suffering severe retaliation, this is what really makes this moment historic. Whatever the outcome of the ultimatum deadline, Traoré has already accomplished something noteworthy. He has shown how much more brittle the foreign control framework that has governed African politics for decades is. Transparency, intelligence, and coordinated continental action are the cornerstones of Traoré's new paradigm. Even if he is removed from office and his ultimatum fails, the pattern he has built will endure. The problem with resistance groups in the digital age is that while you may remove a leader, you cannot remove the millions of young people who are connected, knowledgeable, and capable of looking into and exposing foreign operations. The most important question this narrative poses, though, is what will happen if the Traoré model is adopted outside of Africa? What happens if world leaders begin to oppose foreign meddling with similar strategies? we could be looking at a fundamental reworking of international relations. Here's why you should care. Decisions that impact billions of people who have no say in the matter are made by a select group of powerful nations under the existing international system. We're looking at a future where your voice might truly matter in global decisions that impact your life if Traoré's approach is successful and widely adopted. The deadline for the ultimatum is drawing near. Israeli officials have been actively reaching out to other African governments with aid packages and economic agreements, according to intelligence sources. It's an obvious message. Take sides. Here's what makes this unique. Though the conventional methods of applying pressure are failing, these days, African leaders make decisions in front of millions of young Africans who follow them in real time on social media. 6 other African nations have seen the emergence of comparable movements within 3 weeks after Traoré's ultimatum. Increased activity about foreign activities in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America is being reported by intelligence experts. We may be witnessing the beginning of a worldwide movement that challenges established power structures. With the aid of digital tools, my opinion is that Netanyahu will find a solution that saves face while making enough adjustments to demonstrate that Traoré's challenge had a significant impact. Israel will reorganize its activities and provide West African nations with development assistance. However, diplomatic concessions won't be used to gauge the true success. It will be evaluated by creating a new framework for how smaller countries may compete with superpowers in the digital era. We might be witnessing the start of the biggest change in world politics since the conclusion of the Cold War. The countdown is still going on. The stakes are really high. The precedent has been established, regardless of what occurs when the deadline comes up. There is no turning back now that the era of digital resistance has arrived. What are your thoughts? Will Netanyahu call Traoré's bluff or give in? We are only beginning this topic, so please share your ideas below.